I decided to test my son's humanity with my $150 million company on the line, and I was shocked. I've always believed that hard work and persistence were the keys to success. For decades, I poured my heart and soul into building my business. Martha, my wife, stood by my side every step of the way. Together, we turned a modest convenience store into something much bigger, though we never shared the full extent of our success with our sons, James and Brian. To them, we were just two hard-working parents running a small shop. Nothing more, nothing less. But now, at 65, I'm tired. Running a business this big has taken its toll, and I've started to wonder if it's time to step back. The question is, who will take over? James and Brian are good kids, but they've never shown much interest in what Martha and I do. James runs an auto repair shop in another city, and Brian has a steady desk job in the suburbs. They're both doing fine, but I've always wondered how they'd react if they knew the truth about our business. That's when the idea came to me, a test of sorts. I decided not to tell them about the success of our business. Instead, I planned to see how they'd treat us if they thought we had nothing left. I told Martha my plan, and though she was hesitant, she eventually agreed. We'd tell them the store had gone bankrupt, that we'd lost everything, including our home. Then we'd see who would step up to help us in our time of need. The first step was calling James. I told him we needed to talk and asked if he could gather the family at his house that weekend. He didn't ask too many questions, but I could tell he was curious. On Saturday, Martha and I drove to his house, a spacious place that smelled faintly of lavender, thanks to Linda, his wife. It was clear they were doing well for themselves, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of pride. But I reminded myself of the plan and stayed focused. Once everyone was settled, I laid it out for them. I told them the store had gone under, that the debts had piled up, and we couldn't keep up. I explained that we'd already exhausted our savings trying to stay afloat, and that the bank was taking our house. Martha sat beside me, her hand trembling slightly as she clutched a tissue. I told them we had nowhere to go and asked if we could stay with one of them until we figured something out. The room fell silent. James looked at Linda, who quickly spoke up. She suggested it might be better for us to stay with Brian, since his house was closer to nature. It was an obvious excuse, but I didn't call her out on it. James didn't argue, but what he said next caught me off guard. He agreed to let us stay, but only if we contributed to half the household expenses. His words stung. I'd helped him start his auto shop years ago, putting up a significant portion of the money he needed. I'd never asked for anything in return, and now, when I needed him, he was treating me like a tenant. I glanced at Martha, who looked as though she might cry, but she held it together. I nodded and told James we'd consider his offer, though my chest felt tight with disappointment. On the drive home, I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head. James had always been pragmatic, but this felt cold. I'd expected more from him. Martha tried to reassure me, saying he might have just been caught off guard, but I wasn't so sure. Something about his attitude didn't sit right with me. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but think about the future. Was this how my sons would treat us if we ever truly needed them? Was this the legacy I'd worked so hard to build? And then another thought crept into my mind. What if James wasn't the only one who'd disappoint me? I had high hopes for Brian, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he might react the same way. I knew I had to see this through. I had to know who my sons really were. The stakes were too high to back out now. Moving into James's house felt like stepping into uncharted territory. Martha and I packed our essentials and left the home we had known for decades. James and Linda greeted us at the door with polite smiles, but the warmth I had hoped for wasn't there. From the moment we stepped inside, it was clear we weren't welcome in Linda's eyes. She didn't say much, but her body language spoke volumes. The way she sighed when we unpacked or how she avoided eye contact during dinner. Martha noticed it too and gave me a worried glance. The first few days were awkward. Linda made it clear that our presence disrupted her routine, She would leave passive-aggressive comments about how the house suddenly felt crowded or how much harder it was to keep things clean. James, meanwhile, tried to act as though everything was fine, but he didn't defend us when Linda's remarks became too pointed. I could see that Martha was hurt, but she kept quiet. She's always been the peacekeeper, and this was no different. One evening, I overheard Linda talking to James in the kitchen. She didn't know I was nearby. Her voice was sharp as she asked him how long we planned to stay. She called us freeloaders and said we were taking advantage of them. I stood frozen in the hallway, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. What hurt the most was James's silence. He didn't defend us, didn't tell her how much we had done for him over the years. He just stood there, letting her words hang in the air. That moment cut deeper than I expected. A few days later, Brian called. He said James had told him about our situation. He sounded concerned and asked if there was anything he could do to help. I assured him that we were managing and that it was just a temporary arrangement. Deep down, though, I wondered if I should have taken him up on his offer. I didn't want to burden him or his family, but the tension in James's house was becoming unbearable. Things came to a head about a week into our stay. At dinner, Linda announced that she was pregnant. It was supposed to be a joyous moment, but the way she looked at Martha and me made it clear she saw this as a perfect excuse to push us out. Later that night, James came to me with a sheepish expression. He said that with the baby on the way, they needed the house to themselves. He suggested that Martha and I move into a nearby motel until we figured things out. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything I had done for him, James was asking us to leave. Martha sat quietly beside me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I could see the pain in her eyes, but she didn't say a word. I nodded, not wanting to cause a scene, and told James we'd make arrangements the next day. Inside, I felt like I was falling apart. That night, I called Brian. I didn't tell him everything, just that our stay with James wasn't working out and that we'd need a place to stay for a little while. Without hesitation, he told me he'd come by the next morning to pick us up. His quick response caught me off guard, but it also gave me a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Brian would prove to be different. As I hung up the phone, I looked over at Martha. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her shoulders slumped in defeat. I walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer some comfort. "We'll be fine," I told her. "We'll figure it out." She gave me a small, tired smile but didn't say anything. I knew she was just as heartbroken as I was. The next morning, Brian arrived right on time. He stepped out of his car with a determined look on his face, and for the first time in days, I felt a weight lift off my chest. As we loaded our bags into his trunk, I glanced back at James's house. It didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a reminder of how easily the people you love can let you down. I turned away and climbed into Brian's car, ready to see if this new chapter would be any different. Arriving at Brian's modest home was like stepping into a different world. The house was small but cozy, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood. As soon as we walked through the door, Brian's wife, Sarah, greeted us with a warm smile. Their 2 young kids ran up to us, chattering excitedly about how they'd made space for us in the guest room. It was a stark contrast to the cold reception we'd received at James's house, and I couldn't help but feel a wave of relief. Sarah had gone out of her way to make the guest room comfortable. Fresh linens were neatly arranged on the bed, and she'd even placed a small vase of flowers on the nightstand. She assured us that we didn't need to worry about contributing to household expenses, saying we were family and family helps each other. Martha's eyes glistened with tears as she thanked Sarah for her kindness. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we could finally breathe. In the following days, the warmth in Brian's home began to heal some of the wounds left by our experience with James. The kids brought a lively energy to the house, and their innocent joy reminded me of simpler times. Sarah's generosity and genuine care for Martha and me were evident in every small gesture. Brian, too, went out of his way to make us feel at home. Despite his own busy schedule, he always made time to check in with us, asking how we were doing and if we needed anything. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Brian and I sat on the porch with a couple of beers. The cool night air carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass, and the neighborhood was quiet except for the occasional chirp of crickets. I hesitated for a moment before opening up about how things had gone with James. I told Brian about Linda's remarks, about James's indifference, and how much it had hurt to be treated like a burden by my own son. Brian listened intently, his expression serious but compassionate. When I finished, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "You and Mom have done so much for us. I don't care what it takes. You'll always have a place here." His words hit me harder than I expected, and for the first time in years, I felt a deep sense of pride in my younger son. As the days passed, I found myself reflecting on my relationship with Brian. I realized I'd always underestimated him. James had always been the golden child, the one I thought would follow in my footsteps. But Brian's quiet resilience and selflessness were qualities I'd overlooked for far too long. I began to see him in a new light, and with that came a pang of guilt for not appreciating him more over the years. After a week of living in Brian's home, I decided it was time to come clean. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed and Sarah was tidying up in the kitchen, I asked Brian to join me in the living room. Martha sat beside me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I took a deep breath and began to explain the truth. I told him about the test, about how Martha and I wanted to see how our sons would react if they thought we had nothing left. I watched his face closely as I spoke, searching for any sign of anger or betrayal. Instead, I saw only shock and confusion. Then I dropped the biggest bombshell of all. I told him the store hadn't gone bankrupt. In fact, it had grown into a network of stores worth $150 million. Brian stared at me, his mouth slightly open, as if he couldn't quite process what I'd just said. I went on to tell him that I'd decided he was the one I wanted to take over the business. His loyalty, compassion, and sense of responsibility had proven to me that he was the right choice. For a moment, he was speechless. Then he leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "I don't know what to say," he finally managed, but the gratitude in his voice was unmistakable. I could see the weight of the revelation settling on him, and I knew it would take time for him to fully absorb everything. As I looked at him, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I'd made the right decision after all. 2 months later, the family gathered again, but this time under very different circumstances. Brian had invited James and his family over for dinner at his newly purchased home. The house was impressive, with a spacious open floor plan, high ceilings, and a beautifully landscaped backyard. It was the kind of home that turned heads, and James's reaction was immediate. He stood in the foyer, his eyes wide, scanning the space as if trying to figure out how Brian, who had always lived modestly, could afford such a place. The dinner began with polite conversation, but the tension was palpable. James couldn't hold back his curiosity for long. He finally asked Brian how he managed to afford such a house. Brian glanced at me, and I knew it was time to reveal the truth. I cleared my throat and told James that the house was a gift, purchased with money from the business. His confusion deepened, and I could see him trying to piece it all together. I explained everything: the test, the fabricated story about the store going bankrupt, and our decision to see how our sons would treat us when they thought we had nothing. James's expression shifted from shock to anger as he processed my words. I told him plainly that the house, and the responsibility of running the family business, had gone to Brian because he had shown kindness, loyalty, and respect. I reminded James of how he had treated us when we stayed at his home, how he had allowed Linda's disdainful remarks to go unchallenged, and how he had prioritized conditions over compassion. James's face flushed with anger. He demanded to know why we hadn't been honest from the start. Before I could respond, Linda chimed in, her voice sharp and accusatory. She called Martha and me manipulative, saying that our test was unfair and deceitful. Her words stung, but I kept my composure. Brian, however, wasn't as restrained. He stood up, his tone firm as he told Linda that disrespect wouldn't be tolerated in his home. He reminded her that this was about family, and family meant standing by each other, not tearing each other down. The room fell silent. Linda glared at Brian, but she didn't say another word. James, on the other hand, tried to defend his actions. He claimed that he had been cautious because he didn't want to jeopardize his family's stability. I listened, but his excuses felt hollow. I told him that while I understood his need to protect his own family, it didn't excuse the lack of empathy and support he had shown when we needed it most. The evening ended on a sour note. As James and Linda prepared to leave, I pulled him aside. I told him that I wasn't ready to forgive him yet. His actions had revealed a side of him that I hadn't expected, and I needed time to come to terms with it. I reminded him that kindness and respect for family were more valuable than any amount of money. He looked at me, his expression a mix of regret and defiance, but he didn't argue. As their car pulled out of the driveway, I felt a mix of emotions. Disappointment in James lingered, but there was also a sense of relief. The test had shown me who my sons truly were, and while it hadn't gone the way I'd hoped, it had brought clarity. Brian and his family had proven that they understood the importance of loyalty and compassion. And for that, I was grateful. The night ended with a quiet sense of closure, but I knew the journey with James was far from over. Martha and I finally settled into a quaint little house by the sea. The sound of the waves became our morning alarm, and the salty breeze was a constant reminder of the peaceful life we'd worked so hard to build. It wasn't a mansion, but it was ours, and for the first time in years, we felt truly at ease. Brian often visited with Sarah and the kids, filling our home with laughter and warmth. Seeing him flourish as he managed a business brought me a pride I couldn't put into words. James, on the other hand, seemed lost. He called a few times, his tone tentative and unsure. I kept the conversations brief, telling him that only time would show if things could be mended. It wasn't out of spite. It was a boundary I needed to set. I had learned the hard way that respect and love had to be earned, not taken for granted. As I sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I reflected on everything. The test had been painful, but it had revealed the truth about my sons. Money and success meant nothing without the foundation of family and integrity. Brian had proven that actions speak louder than words, and for that, I was grateful. Looking out at the endless ocean, I felt a deep sense of peace. I knew I had made the right choice, and the legacy Martha and I had built was in the hands of someone who truly valued it.
Bye-bye.